Welcome back, everybody, from the long break. I've been gone for quite a while, haven't I? This week will mark the beginning of a new format. Starting today, the podcast will move to every other week. So, as y'all seen, this is going to be what? This comes out the second Monday of the week. Or the second Monday of the month. So, every other week. Next one will be out on the 27th. That way I can deliver better quality scripts. We will begin this episode with something that happened in Goliad, Texas. Some of these events are in Goliad, Texas, and around in the adjoining area, but this goes over a lot of the stuff here. This is a history true crime thing. So we will begin this episode, like I said, something with Goliad, Texas. I've touched on Goliad before with its haunted history, talking about the fort at Goliad, Texas, where a paranormal investigator friend of mine went. Before we start with this history lesson, I need to have a call to action for everybody. So anyone that's listening, I'm going to need you to follow the link in the bio and follow my other socials from Insta to YouTube, everywhere in between. Insta, YouTube, Lemonade, Facebook. I started on Scoops, but not big on it because I don't get too many hits from it. But because Scoops is more like real life in the moment situations, like it's police chases, a lot of crazy stuff that I don't cover. So let's get started with Goliad, Texas, which has a long history that's both haunted and dark. We will start with what is known as the Goliad Massacre and move on to what's known as the Cart Wars. And then I added something else at the very end too. So the Goliad Massacre started on March 16th, 1836 at the Battle of Coleto Creek, where Texas Commander James Fannin ordered the retreat of his men. Him and his men had spent time reinforcing Goliad for a stand, having been informed of the imposing Mexican general Jose de Urrea and his men's advancements. Itchy ear. So, Fannin had been told, hey, y'all gotta retreat. People are coming. The Mexican army's on its way. He didn't want to. He eventually did after a while, right? Some people say this is one of the things that led to the Goliad Massacre. Was his not wanting to leave because they just started or finished reinforcing the fort. After learning the fate of Francis Johnson and James Grant's defeat and the fall of the Alamo, the decision was made to retreat under orders of Sam Houston. So see, he had information ahead of time. He waited until he's like, okay, so what happened over there? Oh, they lost. Guess it's time for us to go. Having to postpone the retreat to wait for supplies, carts, and oxen to take the needed supplies. So they needed stuff, they needed carts, and they needed something to pull the carts. Oxes or oxen to take the needed supplies. Urrea had learned of this retreat by capturing couriers and had planned accordingly. So the Mexican army is already one step ahead of them. They're like, okay, so they're trying to leave. Bet. This retreat was one of the worst planned in history. The oxen that were to be used were left unfed for long periods of time, so the animals weren't taken care of. The cargo to be taken was 9 cannons and 1,000 muskets, and a little bit of food and water. Not enough. They were like, let's take weapons. We need weapons. No one thought about food. I know me. I would have been like, hey, can I trade my gun for a sandwich or something? Because we're about to go on a long trip. With what should have been a long head start on the retreat, was delayed heavily with an hour lost at the San Antonio River with a cart breaking down and one of their largest cannons falling into the water. They had to fish it out of the water, more time lost there. And they lost more time when they had to stop and let the ox graze. So they had to stop to let the animals eat, right? This last stop was protested due to not knowing if the Mexican army was following them. Most of the men believed that they would not follow them. So they're like, some of the men in the army were like, there's no way they're behind us. Everyone else was like, they're behind us. The Mexican army was hot on their trail. Jose Urrea and his men quickly left Goliad without artillery and the full complement of his forces. He had left with only 8 cavalrymen and 360 infantrymen. So he didn't take his full army. He just like, well, look, we got to get going. Let's take a little bit. Let's just take a few. Using his scouts, he had found out that the Texan army was a lot smaller than he had originally been informed about. With his confidence in his men, he had sent 100 of them back to assist with the fort. Can you imagine that? Like, you're that confident and you're like, you know what? We don't need all y'all. Some of y'all need to go back. We got this. That's confidence in your men. That's machismo. That's Mexican. That's some Mexican stuff right there. Did it pay off? Well, we'll tell you later on. The rear guard had failed to notice the advancing Mexican army. They had finally loaded up the oxen and tried to set off again. But as soon as they had done so, another cart broke down. They had to transfer all of its contents to another cart. The Mexican commander had ordered his men to halt the Texan army. So they caught up to them. They were 2 hours. They were ahead of them. They lost 2 hours and they got caught. So with this, the Texan army dug in and tried to push forward to the timberline in a better defensive position. So there was a tree line just up ahead, right where they were trying to get to. They're like, if we can get there, we got this. With about 500 yards to their defensive position, another cart, not just any cart, it was the most important cart they needed. It was the ammo cart, had broken down. Fannin proceeded to call a council. Fannin proceeded to call his council to see if there was any options or if it was feasible to retrieve this cart. So he called his council of men. He's like, his generals, not his generals, but his captains with him. He's like, hey, what do we do? And Urrea took advantage of this situation because he saw what was going on. He was like, hey, we got this. Urrea took advantage of this situation and launched his attack. With limited supplies and being in an open field that obstructed their vision, because tall grass and stuff like that, right? That obscured their vision, they had no other choice but to settle in for the fight at hand. The defense was 3 ranks deep. Each man had received 3 to 4 muskets, bayonets, handguns, and ammo. They had set up in a position with sharpshooters covering the mobile hospital, which was at a less than desirable location due to the ox being shot during the firefight. So their mobile hospital got taken out, or the ox pulling it. So they had to stop. Wherever it stopped, that's where they were like, this is it. They were attacked on all sides. Rifle company under Morales assaulted the left side. Grenadiers and part of another battalion under Urrea's command charged the right. Another battalion led by Colonel Mariano Salas led the front charge, and the Nunez cavalry charged the rear. So they were in a square position, right? They were just a big old square of men, and they fought on all 4 sides. On March 19th, Fannin defended his position with about 300 men versus Urrea's 80 cavalrymen and 260 infantrymen. The Mexicans soon overtook the Texan army. Most of these men on the Mexican side were veterans from the attack on the Alamo. So these guys were already battle vetted. They won. The Alamo fell, So these guys were used to it. They're like, we got this. I say that a lot. Sources on both sides exaggerated the opposition's numbers. Urrea had left with a small number of men so as to not let the Texans get too much of a head start, with orders to send reinforcements. So when he left, he was like, look, we're going to catch up to them. We don't want them to get too far ahead. Once more people get here, send some more people. With orders to send reinforcements by morning, the troops went from around 500 to closer to 1,000 units. Throughout this fight, the Texans never faltered. Lines never broke. So they dug in. They did not break their formation. They had used their resources well, so much so that the Mexican general was impressed. Ironically, the Mexicans were running low on ammo also. Both sides suffered great injury and losses. In an attempt to end this quickly, the Mexicans set up snipers to inflict as much damage as possible. It took the Texan sharpshooters some time to quell the attacks, to hone in on their targets, by focusing in on the muzzle flashes from the enemy. So they had no clue where these shots were coming from. If it wasn't for the poof that they saw, they would have never been able to fight back. Fannin had been waiting for the return of Horton and his men, but that was to never happen due to them being unable to cross the Mexican lines. William Ward and the Georgia Battalion, defeated in the previous battle of Refugio, were within distance to hear the gunfire during their retreat, but battered and hungry, they were unable to assist till they reached Victoria. So there was another battalion that was close by that could have helped, but they were like, we're already done. We need to go recoup. So they had to get to the next fort, Fort Victoria, and then backtrack. Of course, Urrea knew this already because he was still capturing their couriers. So to further cripple these defenses, They surrounded the Georgia Battalion and forced them to surrender at the Guadalupe riverbed. I wrote surrender. I misspelled it. So they're still capturing the couriers. They can't get messages across without the Mexican army knowing what's going on. Back at the battle, Urrea kept the Texans on their toes throughout the night by having his men play attack bugle calls. So, you know how when in baseball it's that bugle for everyone goes, charge! That's basically what he was doing, which is weird. I never understood why they did that during battles. This position that they had was part of their downfall. Due to not being near a water source and unable to cover, meant that they had to endure the sounds of bugles all night long with being cold and thirsty. So there was nothing there. They were hungry. They could have light a fire because it give away their exact positions. They already knew where they were, but light a fire, you see shadows, you see people. You're having men taken out. Fannin and his council were contemplating making their getaway at night, but that would not be the case. They did not want to leave their men behind, who some were family and close friends. So they dug in, literally digging trenches covered by broken carts and dead animals. So they did everything they could to try to make this last. They're like, we're not going to lose. By morning, the Mexican troops had been refreshed, new troops, ammo, and weapons delivered from Goliad. Urrea had his new artillery placed on the high ground. After possibly 2 shots from the high ground, Fannin and his men thought it would be best to surrender under honorable terms. So they're fighting, they're digging in, they're ready, and they look up on a hill. They see some big-ass cannons. 2 shots, they're like, yeah, I think we're done here. Surrender? Yeah, that's about right. So Fannin and Urrea met, and under the terms of surrender, that they would be the POWs, prisoners of war, to be turned over to the United States. Unfortunately, Urrea could not officially accept these terms. Under Santa Anna's orders, he had told Fannin that he would act as an intermediary for Fannin and his men. So Santa Anna had different orders. There was no capturing alive situation for Santa Anna. He wanted to send a clear-cut message to the Texans. So he was like, look, you're surrendering. I'm going to try to do this as best as I can. I'm going to send a letter to Santa Anna, and I'm going to vouch for you. But if he says no, there's nothing I can do about it, was the situation. And I'm pretty sure he wasn't talking like me. I don't know how they talk back then. But there's actual paperwork of the surrender that shows I still wrote surrender. I just don't know how to spell the word surrender. That shows that they were subject to the disposition of the supreme government. So there's paperwork that says like, hey, I know this is what you said. This is what we want to do because they surrendered honorably. But it is up to you. In my terms. And legal whatever terms back then, they probably said like, yeah. It's what it's basically, But this is another reason why this is seen as like one of the biggest blunders in war. Fannin had not made this clear to his men. He didn't tell them like, hey, there's a chance that they're just going to kill us. He was like, look, I talked to them and they said some stuff. Don't worry about it. That'd be the worst thing to hear from your commander. Not the full details like, listen, man, I'm not going to lie to you. There's a chance that they're just going to kill us. They should have said something. Those that were able to walk were led back to Goliad. Doctors were made to ignore the injured Texans and assist the Mexican wounded. Of course, they're like, hey, don't focus on your men. You're our doctors now. Focus on these guys. Fannin was left on the battlefield, injured, while Urrea and his men continued to secure Guadalupe Victoria. This is where he sent a letter to Santa Anna requesting clemency for the captured Texans. After a week, Santa Anna had bypassed Urrea and ordered Colonel José Nicolás de la Portillo to carry out a congressional decree. So, Urrea sends a letter. He sends a letter. Dear Santa Anna, these guys gave up. I think we should let them live. Send them back to their government. Let them deal with it, Let me know what you think. Sincerely yours, Urrea, right? Santa Anna receives a letter. He's like, nah, bump that noise. We got to send a message here. Send this to José Nicolás de la Portillo. Tell him this is what I said. And bypasses him. The congressional decree to execute Fannin and his entire command and to deem them as pirates. This was the Goliad Massacre, carried out on Palm Sunday, March 27th, 1836. Due to poor planning and underestimating an enemy, is what led to this chain of events. That was just leadership on the Texan side, but amongst the men, there were heroes. They did as they were told and fought bravely. Although overshadowed by the events at the Alamo, the loss of life was twice that of the Alamo. This is the event that led to the famous battle cry, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." And the rest is history. I bet y'all didn't know that there was a second part to Remember the Alio, to remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. So yeah, so just, poor leadership, Fannin. He was proud. He didn't want to leave the base. He didn't want to leave Goliad. He reinforced it. He thought that they were going to be able to make it, right? But after hearing what happened, 3 different groups got taken out. He was like, I guess we have to leave. Sam Houston was like, hey, you got to go now. We've been telling you this. So he finally left. And he decided to take more weapons than supplies. If they wouldn't have taken all those weaponry, they would have gotten there 2 hours earlier, because they wouldn't have had to stop for that cart that broke down because of the weight of the cannon, or the cannon that fell into the water because it's heavy. It got pushed by the water and into the river. Or all the ammunition. They wouldn't have had to need that much. They could have taken more supplies, water, food, and then some ammo, and kept on going. But the men, the Texans on both sides, Texans and Mexicans, they were heroes. They did what they were told. They just because an army wins doesn't make them heroes. Within their own country, they're heroes. Within their own beliefs, they're heroes. The Texan side, because I'm proud to be a Texan, I'm, Texan born and raised, they fought bravely. They held their own, and they did whatever they could. They lasted the night. Mexicans, because I'm Mexican proud, they said, look, we don't need everybody. We got this. And they did. And then in the morning, they were like, look, this is our show of power. You're either going to stop, or we're really going to show you what's going to happen. And they decided to stop. I hear movement. It's my dog. The next part of this history lesson will go over a special tree located again in Goliad, Texas. This tree is an oak tree with long branches strong enough to support a person's weight. Now, that's going to come into play later on. If you see the name of the title of this episode, you kind of have a clue as to what it's about. Topo Chico. With the animosity from the fight against the Mexicans still being felt some 25 years later, with Texas being in its infancy as a state, routes and infrastructure were still being established. This came to a head when a team of cartmen had been hauling freight between towns, starting noticing that they were getting less and less jobs due to the Mexicans undercutting their prices and putting Texas cartmen out of business. So the war is over 25 years later, or maybe, sometime later, right? They're setting everything up and they're like, okay, this is what we do. This is our mail route. And they're like, wait a minute, why are we not getting as many contracts as we used to? It's basically like UPS and FedEx battling out. UPS came first, and then FedEx came and started getting as strong. That's the best comparison I can do to today's standards. Soon the Texans decided to take things into their own hands. They began setting up traps and attacking the Mexicans who came across Goliad. Within a short amount of time, 75 Mexicans were murdered, their freight taken, and the carts destroyed. Can you imagine if this was how Wells Fargo got their foothold in Texas? Because Wells Fargo, their logo is that cart, and that's what they were doing. They were stopping those carts. The authorities in Goliad did little to stop these actions. With time, the Mexican cartmen decided to bypass Goliad altogether by going about 12 to 13 miles to the east and continuing about their business. Soon the people of Goliad noticed their easy way to make some money had stopped, so they moved their operation to the east to continue to rob, plunder, and murder. This went on for some time before it had reached legislation, in other words, the governor's office. But it was not the government's involvement that brought this to an end. It was the people and a swift judge named, this is what they called him, Judge Lynch, like lynching. You made the connection already, right? Made quick work of anyone that was involved with stealing the carts. The cart cutters, as they were called, were taken to the oak tree in front of the courthouse, and there they were hung, right there. Today, this tree provides shade for the people of Goliad. So that was a quick little insert, right? So Goliad, Texas has a lot of history. I think one of these days I should head out there, and I'd take some pictures at the tree, some video footage at the fort. Take my meta glasses with me, record some stuff there, and post it to whatever platform is up and running by the time this happens, right? Because we don't know what's happening next. Now, before we leave, and since we just talked about the hanging tree, let's get more specific. And this isn't in Goliad, this is still in Texas, though. Before I end this episode, I want to stay on the subject of hangings. Next, we will travel to San Patricio. We're going to talk about Josefa Chipita Rodriguez. She's believed to be the first woman to be hanged in Texas. She was born either in 1773 or 1799. 27 years difference. 26. Records are a little sketchy that far back. Even the spelling in her name is a source of contention. Yeah, they couldn't get the way her name was spelled. If it was Josepha, Josefa, or just with an F, they couldn't. Everything was up for grabs. Her family had moved to an area by the Nueces River in 1836, after her father went AWOL from Santa Anna's army earlier. So he stopped the war. He was like, I'm not dying for somebody else. I quit, and he went to the Texas side. Not joined the Texans, he just moved to Texas. When she was about 20 years old and had a child, that's all I wrote. When she was about 20 years old and had a child, I'm pretty sure I had a lot more thought process in there. So she grew up, got married, had a kid, and started up a small little area, right? That did not last long. Her husband left and took their child with him. Soon after that, she lived in a hut near the Nueces River, where those traveling could stop by and rest. So like the first rest stop, right? She would provide meals and a cot to those traveling the harsh conditions. Soon a man named John Savage, that's an awesome name, Savage. He had been seen at a saloon earlier that day in San Patricio bragging about a recent sale he had done to the Union Army of some horses. So he sold some horses to the Union. Now remember, we are in Texas. That is the Confederate South. Being in the South, the Confederate South, this was not a good thing to brag about. So he's supplying horses to the enemy, unless he's giving them like sick and dying horses, he's giving them supplies. Rules of war: if you are a arms dealer, never get caught selling to both sides. This was during the Civil War. After spending the day drinking, he rode over to Chipita's house, or hut, where she made him a hot meal and gave him a place to sleep in front of the hut. In the morning, to everyone's knowledge, he had left. As far as anyone knew, he was gone. He took off early that morning. Unfortunately, a few days later, 2 slaves had found Savage's dismembered body in a bag by the river. This is where accounts vary if this was a frame job, a cover-up, or something else. The local sheriff, William Mean, these guys had some crazy names back then. Savage, Mean. I mean, we got to bring this back. Led an investigation that led him to Chipita's place. Stories state, though, that the saddlebags that he had filled with gold were found nearby. And I say stories say that because the sheriff arrested her because he said she did it due to greed. So, because she also knew that he had the gold with him. So, they say she killed him. Chipita's killed Savage because he had gold. But supposedly that gold was found near his body, near the bag filled with his body parts, I guess. She kept saying just one thing as she was taken away. No soy culpable, which means I'm not guilty. Some believe that she was covering for someone named Juan Silvera, which some believe was her supposed son. I couldn't find if Juan was charged for the murder also, or just happened to get caught for another crime. So he was also taken away too at the same time. They were tried both together, because I guess they were part of the same thing, in the 14th district by Judge Benjamin Neal. The verdict, Chipita was the only one found guilty. So they were both, like I said, they were both charged for the same crime. Due to her age, the jury asked the judge for mercy. The judge, Judge Neal, his judgment was death by hanging on the day of November 13th, 1863. So she's old enough that they're like, look, just let her die. Let her go live the rest of her life. She's done. She ain't doing nothing else. The judge is like, nope. She killed somebody. We're going to take somebody. This is why, like, the joke is, like, if you have someone that deserves a death penalty, send them to Texas. We'll put them on it. Because I hate to say it, Texas will put a lot of people on death row. That joke or stereotype holds true. The story does not end there, though. Even though the jury wanted mercy, the people wanted the hanging. So the jury was like, look, don't do it. Just let her live out the rest of her life, whatever's left of it. But lynchings and things like that were a spectacle. They were like going to a ball game back then. People showed up. They had picnics. They brought food. There was entertainment. This was an event for people at the time. I might be exaggerating picnics and shit like that, but like this was an event. People showed up and like threw stuff like in the movies, But that's what people wanted. It was mob mentality. They were like, oh, they got riled up together. Lynching mobs were popular because who doesn't like a good hanging? That was my stupid joke. I don't know why I wrote that. I think I chuckled to myself when I wrote that too when I was writing the script. Two separate groups were thwarted heading to where she was being held, which was at Sheriff Means' home. So they were trying to get this lynching on early. They're like, look, we're going to get her done now. She was also supposedly put in leg chains, so she couldn't move her legs and hands. So if they would have caught her, they would have got her. Where she was taken to the courthouse for her safety. She was eventually moved. She was eventually taken to a grove of trees where she was hanged from the tallest tree and buried in a coffin at the foot of that tree. Now, this is where we're going to switch gears a little bit and move on to the paranormal side of things. Because, it's Spooky Mysteries. We cover history, true crime, paranormal. And this one's going into paranormal history / paranormal events. This is where it turns into a legend. According to legend, before her coffin was even put in the ground, onlookers could hear a woman moaning, "No soy culpable." At night, people have reported what looks like a woman roaming the riverside, where her hut once stood, crying, "No soy culpable," with her cries echoing across the river and into nearby woods. Over time, her story has been turned into poems, books, an opera, and a screenplay, and that was as recent as 2010. Side note, because I am a child, the opera was written by Professor Lawrence Weiner. I am a kid. That's Weiner. Anyways, let's get serious again. Her cries did not go unheard. A historical marker was placed in San Patricio detailing her story, and in 1985, State Senator Carlos Truan from Corpus Christi brought forth before legislature to absolve Chipita Rodriguez of murder. On June 13, 1985, she was absolved of murder and signed by Governor Mark White, which means que no era culpable, or she was not guilty. So, yeah. That's what it means. She was not guilty. Now, before I end this, let's do a recap. Because I don't usually do recaps. We're going to do recaps. We're advancing in our podcast abilities too. I'm going to create like an intro for this and an outro for this too. Let's do a recap. So, yeah, that way we're not just ending stuff and whatever, right? Like I do on my Reels and TikToks, it just stops. Now, we're going to do a recap. So, we first talked about the Goliad Massacre, where those in charge showed strengths and weaknesses, which led to lies and death. Then we talked about the cart wars, where the effects of the Goliad Massacre could be linked with the murders of the Mexican cart runners. Because there was still tension. They were like, look, they kicked our ass. We're going to get them back. Kind of thing, Then we finished off with a weeping woman story. But not one looking for her kids, one seeking justice for a crime she may or may not have committed. Personally, it was not for greed. If they really found the gold nearby, he was bragging that he supplied the North with horses, which he lived in the South. Not a bright move. So, if you're bragging that you're giving the enemy stuff in a bar full of crazy people, drunks, guess what's going to happen? They're going to come take your money, and put you out. And that's what happened. So there's a high probability that she was innocent. Most likely she was. She might have been covering for her supposed son. So let's wrap this up. Please like, follow, and subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, follow there, subscribe there. If you see this on Instagram, Spotify, all that stuff, like the episode, put a comment, let me know what's going on. And that wraps up episode 1, season 3. Stay spooky, everyone, and until next time, later. Leave some space here for the outro. Do 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 do.